Well, good evening, folks, and thank you for joining me tonight. This is a Facebook Live event, and our agenda tonight, of course, is to talk about what happened in Parliament yesterday, which was the speech from the throne that was delivered by the Governor-General, and that's our tradition. But it's really written by the Prime Minister and the people around him, and they've come up with what is one of the longest speeches from the throne with a whole bunch of words and all kinds of different things in it that we want to analyze here tonight. And I'm here to go through that with you. We've gone through it in some detail, and we want to look at what it means and what it means particularly for Calgary and Alberta going forward here. But the thing that I'd like to address first of all is the overarching theme of it, which was not a time for austerity. This is not a time for austerity. Now, I don't know where the Prime Minister came up with that word, because I'm not sure he even knows what it means. But it seemed to me like it was a political jab at saying that we have to continue spending hundreds of billions of dollars in order to kind of make sure we get through what we're going through right now. And we are going through something. But spending the way we've been spending is a little over the top. Let's look at what austerity actually means, because we're actually talking about getting this spent elegantly and making sure that things are spent well in this process. This is our job as government. At this point in time, we're spending about twice as much on income support than the amounts that were not earned in the process. That's throwing money against the wall and seeing what will stick. And that has to eventually ease its way back as we learn in this process. This government needs to learn, and we need to make sure that we don't continue down that path. We are now we have the highest unemployment rate in the G7 group of companies. And we're spending the most on support mechanisms in the G7 as well. I think it's only a matter of time, given our economy size and what we're doing to it, where we might not be one of the top 7 economies in the world anymore. So that's something. And there's this issue on fiscal sustainability, and I'd like to make sure Canadians know this. I think a lot of you might know that I got a background in finance, so I find that the government's misleading Canadians on fiscal sustainability here. And I'll give you a quote from the actual speech from the throne there. With interest rates so low, central banks can only do so much to help. There is global consensus that governments must do more. This government will preserve Canada's fiscal advantage and continue to be guided by values of sustainability and prudence. Governments can do so while locking in the low cost of borrowing for decades to come. It's evident to me that with those words on paper, that this government no longer has any financial guidance whatsoever, and that the actual finance officials are not influencing this government whatsoever. This is money that comes from one of the government's own arms, the Bank of Canada, that's buying our bonds in order to keep interest rates low. When you take that buyer out of the equation, things will normalize. And we have yet to see how it normalizes in a good way in the world. We have yet to see any major economy come out of its quantitative easing and what that means. So we're in a permanent state for a while here of devaluation of our currency, or at some point in time, we'll see what happens if there is a potential for interest rates to rocket skywards once we're there. I want to back up and talk about the things in this speech from the throne that I like. Because when I got into politics, I said, politicians can be too critical all the time. And I think it's up to us not just to provide criticism, but to give governments credit where they actually are doing things that are the right things to do at the right time. So you go through what's in this speech from the throne, and the first thing I have to acknowledge is it may have been a right time to have a new speech from the throne, because we're in a pandemic like we've never seen in our lifetime. And this is something where suddenly the priorities of government have changed significantly. So looking after the health and safety of Canadians is first and foremost what we have to do. And there's a small bit at the beginning of this speech from the throne about that. But then there's the economic benefit of actually taking care of people. But let's go with some of the things that I do agree with. And they're splattered throughout this speech from the throne. But I believe that the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy Program is a good program. And the government's agreed to expand that until the end of next summer. In my opinion, This should have always been the income support mechanism that we use as a government. So you keep employees attached to their jobs. You keep the businesses attached to their employees. I think the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit was overspending, but had to get the money out the door quickly. And it's something we should bring to a close so people get more connected with their employer. So CEWS, CEWS as we say, is a program I think that's going to be necessary to continue to mitigate the businesses that will not return quickly to the type of business they were doing before this pandemic started. And hanging on to their employees, I think, is very important. I've met with businesses across Calgary that have told me how difficult it is to bring their employees back when there's a CERB that's saying, $2,000 and you can only earn an extra $999 more. So they're really gerrymandering how they pay these employees at that point in time, which isn't what we're supposed to be accomplishing here. So let's move on. Let's make sure that employees are continuing to be connected to their employers and have a robust economy going forward. EI, the EI changes, moving people to this Canadian recovery benefit and including people that are in the gig economy or self-employed is actually a step forward. One of the things that the pandemic has exposed is how our employment insurance system probably was overgoverned and was ineffective in actually getting money out the door quickly when it needed to get out the door. And I've been in my office in Calgary when that actually happens and people are waiting months to get their EI benefits. So it's been a burdensome program, and maybe we need that social safety net reset that says this is the employment insurance program we have for Canadians of all types of jobs, and here's how it applies, and here's how we actually serve them quickly when they run out of that income that they're acquiring from their jobs. I also believe that strengthening local food supply chains is a good thing, and that's in the speech from the throne as well. How could it not be a good thing? We actually look at how we get food across this country. That's going to require energy. It's going to require a lot of know-how and getting better across Canada. Better drinking water on reserves. How many times have we heard that? And now it's in the speech from the throne? Necessarily. Universal broadband fund. Something we need to push for in Canada is making sure that people across this country have access to high-speed internet, because it is one of the technological advantages that we need to continue to build on going forward in Canada if we're going to continue to have a prosperous economy. And one of the little boutique things that I think is interesting and I agree with is enhancing civilian oversight of our law enforcement agencies. So these are good things. I think these are some of the boutiques, some are responses to the pandemic, but they're parts of what we need to do going forward here. There's a lot now that I want to talk about how it affects Alberta, but in effect with the responses we're having and where the government's aiming on this with their new green recovery, they've shown once again that they don't really appreciate what resource producing provinces are bringing to the equation for Canada, for Canadian unity, for the Canadian economy, and for Canada's environmental future going forward. That's something that continues to be lost on this government, and I'm really, really focused on that at this point in time. One of the things, one of the main parts they have in this speech from the throne includes taking action on extreme risks from climate change. And these are fierce words, and of course climate change is something that we're addressing going forward here, but the government talks about creating 1 million jobs across the country. Well, that's a big number, and I don't know where they're getting that number. We've yet to see it, but it's a nice splashy number. But somehow it's reminiscent of Ontario's green energy strategy and how many jobs were going to come from that didn't ever materialize. And we need to take that lesson, because it's the same architects that are designing this strategy, which means higher energy costs for all Canadians, all Canadian businesses, pushing business out of our jurisdictions and actually not contributing anything to green energy jobs. This is a facade, and we need to call it what it is at the outset. He also talks about creating thousands of jobs retrofitting homes. Now, retrofitting homes is one thing when it makes sense. New builds have new energy systems in them that are all state-of-the-art. The thing about capital investments is they're justified when they actually have a cost-benefit analysis that justifies them. If government's throwing money at it, that's a non-justified expense. And I appreciate why we need to actually make our homes, our buildings, everything more energy efficient. But the science on it and the actual energy expenditure on it is actually going to be more if we just continue to do something without a proper cost benefit analysis on it. So it's a little bit of virtue signaling that I think we need to call out and say, how do we actually get a better emissions future that actually has a result at the end of the day, as opposed to just spending money without a return. Talk about making zero emission vehicles more affordable. What does that mean? That means subsidizing them. Now, I hate to tell this government this, but zero emissions vehicles still require power to get from point A to point B. And that power doesn't really come from batteries. It's stored in batteries. So creating batteries is in itself a carbon emitting exercise. It's a parking spot for power that is still produced somewhere else, that goes into the batteries, that gets expended in the actual trip. This is something that, if we actually subsidize this, we are still not addressing what the green efficiency has to be in better vehicles. Vehicles need to get more efficient, but we again need to make sure that they're done on a cost benefit analysis, and that we're not just tilting at windmills here, not to put too fine a point on it, but make sure that we're actually accomplishing something at the end of the day here. There's a new fund they're putting forward here to attract investment. I'd like to see what the size of that fund is. They've got a $5 billion clean power fund that they're talking about moving forward with as well. And they're talking about making clean energy companies pay half the tax, half the corporate tax of other companies. Now, why not all companies, I'd say? And when we talk about Canadian champions, I sure wish this Prime Minister and the people around him would realize about our Canadian champions in the Canadian oil and gas industry. We have funded this industry in the development of an oil sand resource that is the envy of the world. And our emissions go down year by year. This is a Canadian champion. You look at the amount of money invested by the companies in the Canadian oil and gas sector as far as energy efficiency, as far as greenhouse gas reduction technologies. You look at the results we've had. We are the world leader in this. Now, the Prime Minister talks about being a world leader in clean energy technologies. Prime Minister, we already are. We have the cleanest hydrocarbon sector in the entire world. Give us credit for it and continue to build upon it. If you want to give us half the tax rate because we've done so well, start recognizing that and moving forward with it. But this is something that continues to be not observed by this government, and I think at our own cost. He throws us a sop in this, and I'm going to give you the quote because it's one of those Canada cannot reach net zero without the know-how of the energy sector, including people in places like British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland. Well, thank you. Thanks for including us somewhere in your speech from the throne. But you're right. There's a whole bunch of people here. Scientists, geophysicists, technicians, geologists. This is a scientific industry. This is the most scientific industry in Canada, and requires a whole bunch of commitment from the professionals in this industry that got an education, invested in education, and contribute to this country. They're adding value all the way through here. And energy, again, is a Canadian champion, and we need to continue to have it recognized as a Canadian champion. The government talks about creating nature-based solutions to fight climate change, including planting 2 billion trees. This is a regurgitated promise, as you probably know. 2 billion trees, though, I want you to put that in perspective. Canada is a country with about 340 billion trees. So 2 billion trees is a bit of a drop in the bucket, and I'm not sure what that accomplishes at the end of the day as far as CO2 reduction goes. But they're small trees when you plant them, and hopefully they grow up to be bigger trees, but nevertheless, we're moving there. The other boutiques here we talk about all kinds of things like old age security starting increasing at 75 now, so it's actually something that is a bit of a ramp up. Boosting CPP survivors benefits, having a disability inclusion plan, much like the guaranteed income supplement, having a national housing strategy. Let me advise this government that so far everything they've done to help people buy houses, they've screwed up. So if you're digging a hole, stop digging and get out of it. So move backwards on affordable housing, because everything you've done in this sector so far has not worked. And that's about it. I know there's going to be lots of questions here, but I'm not optimistic as far as how this actually unrolls. It's a lot of words on paper, and if you actually read it word for word, like I did a few times, it is actually a whole bunch of phrases in there. And I've worked in the consulting world, and it's one of those things where, value per word on these papers. This was 6,800 words long, and a lot of those words I think were redundant and unnecessary, and were just words on paper, what we call word salad whenever we hear the Prime Minister talk about things. You can pick those out yourself if you actually get a copy of it. It's an interesting document, and I'm happy here to answer any questions tonight on this. So I'm opening the floor to you, because you probably heard enough from me. How long did I talk for? Almost 15 minutes. Thank you. Any questions here? David Robinson has asked me, have you spoken to Minister O'Regan about the speech? You are a shadow, as we know. Yes, I was named the shadow minister when Aaron named his shadow cabinet, and pleased to do so. And it's an area I think that you recognize they have some expertise. The only conversation we've had so far is via email since my appointment, but I used to speak with Minister O'Regan several times. Minister O'Regan is from Newfoundland, and I know they're going through some issues right now with their oil and gas industry. And he and I actually share some thoughts on it, and I've heard him on podcasts as well. He actually is supportive of the industry, and I'd like to see him carry some more sway with his party in making sure that this industry gets the recognition it deserves to actually contribute to Canada as it has significantly here. Next question. Patty asks, is the CPC prepared to go to an election over the throne speech? The CPC is prepared to go to an election at any point in time now with this minority government. It's the Conservative Party of Canada. We recognize that this is something we can't stand for and support at this point. Ideally, and I'm speaking to you quite frankly, we wish the country would get to know Aaron O'Toole a lot better, because he has a lot to offer Canadians. And right now he's only been through the leadership that took longer than it should have. But getting him in front of Canadians is our number one plan right now, to make sure that they know that we've got an agenda here that appeals to all Canadians. Often they haven't seen themselves in the Conservative Party in the past. So that's our job right now. But there's a lot in this speech from the throne that we have a lot of difficulty supporting. So we'll be ready to act on that. Now I've got some questions that were sent to me ahead of time here. And I'm going to open these up because some of them were quite interesting, and people sent them in ahead of time. So Bob from Altador asks, a majority of Canadians believe our natural resource sector should be part of our economic recovery, and I am one of them. Will you ensure that the resource sector is supported in our economic recovery? Yes, I will. I'm standing up for the resource sector all the time. It's one of the reasons that I was made the shadow minister for natural resources, and it's something I want to make sure that is recognized. When I was elected a year ago, one of my thoughts at the time was that to bridge across the aisle and make sure that there's parliamentarians on all parties and all sides of the House that know how important this is, that actually look at it like a businessman, like a consultant, and say, here's what we're trying to accomplish, what are the options we have on the table, and how do we get from point A to point B most expeditiously. And I think that includes, more than anything, our Canadian resource industry. We talk about climate change, and climate change is the norm here. I don't go into a meeting in Ottawa where somebody doesn't bring up climate change. And invariably, the response I get whenever we talk about how much we contribute to the reduction in CO2 emissions in the world, I get this statement from whoever is there from one of the parties that what we really need to do is to train people in Alberta to do something else besides oil and gas, because it's a dead industry now. Just the level of a lack of understanding about how much we are an advanced industry, how much we're an industry that's going to prosper in the world for years to come, is lost on people here as they bought into a mantra that we're just supposed to be retrained to do something else. That's something that I think, I wanted to gain some resonance with, and a lot of the people I meet with have say they've already drank the Kool-Aid before they get elected, and they're not getting off of their mantras. So I'll keep trying. That's what I think we have to do, is make sure that the message of how important our resource industry is to Canadians is well understood across the country. Eddie asks me now, can you get government to commit to an efficiency KPI or a metric on green energy, clean tech, to spend to hold them accountable? For example, for a project that yields 1 ton of greenhouse gas removal for every $1 spent should be dropped versus a 100 ton of greenhouse gas removal for every $1 spent. So it's a kind of a complex question here that it is asked, but the key success indicators in all these issues are something that government lacks right now, and in this government in particular, they continue to virtue signal that they want to accomplish something, but then take no responsibility for the plan of actually getting to that solution. There are a number of advisors to this industry that are just about moving in a direction as opposed to understanding how you move in that direction effectively. And that's something that needs to get better in this government. And I hope we replace this government and come up, you'll see a better plan with a new government going forward, I'm sure, Eddie. Thanks for the question. Juan asked me, do you support the initiative for a national pharmacare program? Pharmacare is one of those things, and this is one of the issues with the speech from the throne we have here now, and that frankly, I think the government of the day is taking advantage of, is they're looking at how do we continue to spend in order to deliver as much as possible. There is a point where all kinds of programs eventually have to get paid for. The other issue that was in this speech from the throne that I neglected to speak about was a new proposal for childcare. Now, childcare is one of those issues that's been on the agenda for several decades. And fortunately, it's provincial jurisdiction, so you have some competing programs across Canada, the way it's delivered. And the federal government here is sort of saying they want to go back into provincial jurisdiction and have a national standard about what we're going to do on childcare. There's a necessity of having childcare as women come out of the pandemic here, but you take a look at paying for it at the end of the day. This government's going to, say we're throwing money against the wall here, so we are going to spend billions of dollars with the childcare program. Likewise with the pharmacare program, if we can afford a national pharmacare program, Canadians would be all over it. A lot of Canadians have seen their pharmacy costs rise. But again, it's a provincial program. We want to make sure that we don't have jurisdictional creep across the country going forward here. You'll recognize what's going to probably happen here with the speech from the throne is that the NDP is probably going to fall in line behind the Liberals here and support it. And what that means is they're going to continue to spend money because their proposal was a national pharmacare program. So think about that and what the ransom will be to support this program going forward. It is a lot of money, and there's a lot of money being thrown against the wall on this. But like Eddie said in the last questions, what is the outcome of the money you're spending here, and is there a better way to get better value for Canadians in any of these programs? That's our job. Courtney Bishop now asked me, did you know that O'Toole was pro-Paris Agreement before you endorsed him? Albertans felt like that was a bait and switch post winning the leadership by O'Toole. So the issue with Paris is an environmental accord, as everybody knows, the Paris Accord, where we commit to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Being opposed to Paris means we're being opposed to environmental progress. We are not opposed to environmental progress. Paris is a complex document that was poorly negotiated by our Canadian team. We need to make sure we get credit for what we're bringing to the equation around the world according to the Paris Accord. There are all kinds of ways of meeting and not meeting the Paris Accord. Many countries are not going to meet the Paris Accord. We need to make sure that as we adjust going forward, that we get credit for all the greenhouse gas reductions that we're contributing to the world, including getting our natural gas to tidewater and offshore, and continue going forward. There is no party right now that doesn't endorse in Canada the Paris Accord. Like I say, it is an environmental accord that we need to make sure we get credit in Canada for the things we're not getting credit for right now. So I don't think that Aaron O'Toole has changed his position on this at all. And I think in order for us to win this election, we need to make sure that we've got a legitimate environmental plan going forward here that recognizes we agree to some international standards about how we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions around the world. I hope that answered the question effectively. Got more questions here that were pre-submitted as well. Chris from the Beltline was talking about his partner in an email to me who resides in the U.S. And they've been a cross-border relationship since 2018. But they've not seen each other in over 6 months because of the current border restrictions. Chris and dozens of others in my riding have asked, when will the government expand the definition of family and essential travel to include non-married couples? My colleagues have been very good at this. Shannon Stubbs, my predecessor actually at National Resources, she has actually gained some significant traction with the government in trying to get recognition of people that aren't fitting the definition of a married couple, but have been committed for a long time, that are on opposite sides of the border since this pandemic began, and getting them the access to see each other as if they were married couples. It's essential. It's about people, and at the end of the day, the government's supposed to be here to look after people, whether those people are Canadians right now or whether they're people that are seeing Canadians or strongly committed to Canadians and need to see their loved ones and their loved ones' kids that are part of their lives. We support that, and we're pushing on that with Minister Blair as hard as we can. So, Chris, we'll continue to go to bat for you on that one. Kathy asked me, how much tax are people willing to pay to support all these programs in the speech from the throne? Well, great question, Kathy. Nobody talks in this speech from the throne about how they're going to raise money. The only issue about raising and changing taxes was to go after those exorbitantly rich Canadians and corporations that are avoiding taxes right now, and go after them for their corporate shares, their options share deductions. So that's one thing that they're putting on the table here. If you're paid in options right now, if options are part of your compensation plan, I think it's pretty clear that they're going after that as some additional taxation revenue. Otherwise, there's no taxation revenue. So this government's going to run about, at this point in time, in the first 8 months of the year, about a $380 billion deficit. So we'll see what it is at the end of the year. But think about that as a recurring basis. It's only a matter of time before we're broke as a country, and at that point in time we've got some serious reckoning to do with the International Monetary Fund, how we pay our bills, and the government's of the mind of the pretense, if you will, that it doesn't matter how much money we print. We've got low interest rates now, so print more and more and more, and that is a circular argument that doesn't make sense. And I think that if anybody wants to go into a discussion on quantitative easing, we can do it, and we can come to my office, but I don't want to lose too much of the audience on that rabbit hole. Thank you, though. Susan asked me, you said they were putting twice as much dollars into the system as has been lost. Is the measure that we're trying to balance that? How would you reduce the spending? And then it says Ross, so I'm not sure if that was from Susan or Ross. But yes, the issue about CERB, getting the money out the door quickly was one of the objectives of the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. So we did get the money out the door quickly. $80 billion went out under CERB initially, when $40 billion was lost in income. So we doubled down on money going into the economy, and some stimulus was associated with that, obviously, as people were able to spend more, but also some people were able to save more. But that's government money, that's taxpayer money that went in. And in the first tranche, getting money out the door quickly was obviously the intent. Now that we've learned from that, getting that more refined going forward is something the government should take note of and make sure they do better next time. That we're not continually putting more money into people's hands than they would earn in a normal economy. Eddie asked me again. Eddie's got a second question up on the board here. What are the Conservatives' position on nuclear energy? I think that we are falling behind in nuclear versus other countries, and nuclear would be an important part of carbon neutral future. Canada used to be a leader through AECL, Crown Corporation, and its CANDU reactors. That seems to be neglected now. Eddie's right. We have been a leader in the world in nuclear energy. We're still a leader in the world in nuclear energy. You look at the actual portfolio of energy sources in Canada, nuclear is about 20% of our energy input. And that's been steady. We haven't increased that. I know a lot of the provinces now are looking at the new technologies, which are small modular reactors. And that's something we can deploy it in a smaller area than you would before. Those aren't readily deployable right now, but work is being done in order to move those forward. It is, you're right, a non-carbon emitting form of energy, and is part of the solution going forward. I often say, when people say, look at politicians, look at what they did before they became a politician. And I was a portfolio manager. So in a portfolio manager's job, you actually take a look at not being exposed to any one sector. So in Canada, we're blessed with an abundance of power sources, and ensuring we have a multitude of power sources is something that I think is going to continue to be our benefit going forward. One of those sources is and will be nuclear. As we really excel at this, we need to make sure it makes sense from an economic point of view again. But like carbon, we need to make sure that we actually fully cost all of the externalities of every one of these power sources, including the batteries associated with renewable energy, so-called renewable energy. The batteries are often from expensive and finite minerals as well, cobalt being probably the most identifiable about what happens when the end of life happens for those chemicals that comprise those batteries. Those are part of the equation as well, as far as what we need to cost in the equation. Every one of these power sources does have its externalities, that is, its environmental costs, that need to be addressed as we look at changing the portfolio of energy sources we have. I have another question pre-submitted to me. It's Paul. He's a recent university graduate, and he says, I watched the speech from the throne, but didn't see anything. The promise to create jobs does not pay the rent bills. I'm hoping you have additional information on what benefits may be available after the Canada Emergency Student Benefit. I don't have information on that. I'm sorry, Paul, but the Canada Student Jobs was one that we worked on really strenuously before this summer to make sure a lot of students were going to be employed in Calgary Centre. My office was involved in hundreds of applications, and we left with more than 500 applications that weren't funded. And it's one of the great debacles of what happened in this whole pandemic was the government got cute, if you don't mind me putting it that way, and tried to come up with a new program where they were paying volunteers through one of their chosen charities. The We Charity scandal you've probably heard about, as opposed to putting that money into a program where students were actually going to do productive work. And that still irritates me, because we had a program, we had applications, we had jobs, we had the ability to deliver, and we didn't deliver, and that's a failure. So that's something this government needs to make sure that they get hung around their necks here, because I'm not happy about it, and nobody should be. As far as the jobs going forward in Calgary, we are at a high level of unemployment in Calgary, and I am certain that the technology associated with Calgary oil and gas companies developing alternatives going forward here should lead to more jobs, but we have to make sure that there's transparency on that, what that means for the oil and gas companies going forward here. Got a new question from Ben Chan. Ben asks, where is the largest opportunity for Canadian job creation in the Conservatives' view? Technology, Ben. There's all kinds of resource jobs. Resource jobs are becoming more and more efficient. The oil sands is becoming a better and better and more efficient source, and you look at how much we've developed that. But there's all kinds of technologies that continue to be applied to our resource industry that are adding value throughout the equation. Financial technologies as well. You take a look at how many jobs are associated with administrative jobs in both the financial sector and also in the government sector, where there's good technology development that's going to continue to make those issues and those service delivery more efficient and obviously better outcomes for all Canadians. So I think that we've got a very well educated population in Canada. We need to make sure we take advantage of that and build upon those kinds of jobs going forward. Don't mistake the fact that we still have a strong resource economy, and those resources are going to continue to pay the bills going forward in Canada. People don't recognize how many of the bills are paid for by the resource industry in Canada, and I've seen the numbers. It's around 20% when you count the taxation revenue that comes off the employees in those sectors and the royalties and the corporate taxes. It's a significant amount of money going into government coffers across the country, and nothing's free. So all those taxes that are paid by our resource industries fund programs that Canadians benefit from, including our education and our health fare. So we've ridden on the backs of our resource industries for years, and we need to make sure they get a recognition for how much value they add to our society. Got another question from Eddie. Eddie says, what's your view of using nation building, large-scale infrastructure programs to stimulate the economy? Eddie, there's all kinds of ways we can actually use nation building type of projects. You think about where you look at a cost benefit analysis again. Often I see people make choices, governments make choices, that say this is what we want done, therefore it's nation building. If you're talking about a high-speed rail line between Windsor and Quebec City, it better make sense for all Canadians at the end of the day, and it better make economic sense for Canadians, not just it's a nice Lamborghini and we want to have it, and it'd be great to have. We need to look at what's a need to have and what are the alternatives that make a lot of sense. So nation building to me is one of those things where you actually have to show that it actually adds value to the country, both from an economic point of view, but also from a Canadian point of view about how it actually binds us. One of the things about this government that I think most people know, if you're calling me from Alberta, you know that it's been a divisive government. Holding this country together is going to be the effort going forward, and we need to make sure that the plans we have include Canadians from coast to coast. Anne is asking me a question now. She says, hello, Greg. Do the Conservatives realistically think that Alberta will ever get Tidewater access and reduce global emissions using our gas, given the government's green energy plans? That's the Coastal GasLink is well on its way as far as its approval going, and one of the most frustrating parts of this last Parliament was when we got the blockades on a rail line through British Columbia, through many parts of the country, but it was based on the negotiations that were happening by some parts of some of the native bands up in northern British Columbia. Those negotiations apparently have happened, so I'm confident we're going to get that gas pipeline. That gas pipeline adds a lot of value to Canada. One of the comparisons I always like to make is the Australian economy. The Australian economy before COVID, didn't have a recession in 29 years. Now, some of that is based on resource development that we no longer accept in Canada, and that includes coal-based. But part of it is their natural gas development, and they successfully and expensively developed their liquefied natural gas resource that somehow our regulatory system in Canada didn't allow us to get over the line. And that's a failure. That's a decade-long failure of not getting an environmentally resource-friendly resource to market in China and other parts of Asia that are burning all kinds of coal and other fuels that are much more carbon intensive than the natural gas that they could have sourced from Canada. So fail Canada, fail as far as economic benefit to the country, but bigger from an environmental perspective. Think about how much CO2 would not be in the atmosphere if that regulatory regime we had enabled us to get those resources offshore on a timely basis. This is something that needs to get better in Canada. So yes, I do believe we need to move forward with that. I'm not sure how quickly it'll happen under this regime, but that regime needs to change, as we know, and we're committed to making sure that moves forward. Thank you. Maurice in Elbow Park asked me, I'm a bit concerned about the slogan currently chosen for the Conservative Party. In my mind, it immediately sets up a polarized approach to the Canadian electorate. We need less of that and more of trying to get everyone to pull to the same side of the rope. Rather than riffing on Trump's slogan and using Take Canada Back, I think you should consider the success of Clinton's message of it's the economy, stupid, and go with where's the growth? Well, thanks, Maurice. And I know there's a lot of input that goes into these things as far as target markets and focus groups and everything. But I really think that characterizing us as pro-Trumpian is a little severe. I think that we're actually looking at what's happening in Canada right now and making sure that we get back to being proud of being Canadians and not having our statues torn down. And I'm for that. I'm all in favor of making sure that people that commit acts of public sabotage and public defacement, graffiti, whatever the case is, get charged for that. And I think that our forefathers have given us and gifted us a wonderful country. We stand on the shoulders of giants, as we always say in politics, and these people have built us something that is the envy of the world. To tear them down now as if they didn't exist, or as if we're only judging them based on what we see now as their sins, is a little one-sided. And I want to make sure that we have that open dialogue about what this person did right and what this person did wrong and how we do it differently now. But nevertheless, they built us something pretty excellent here that we need to make sure we build further. Thank you. I've got another question here from Michelle. Going back to energy sector, is there a way to feature energy innovations overall under the umbrella that Alberta has initiated already financially, like a virtual conference globally to drive optics of how fantastic our investments have been historically and what it can look like as a world-class center of excellence out of Alberta? Well, agreed, Michelle. We have to tell our story very well. You take a look at what we've done in Alberta for a long time. AOSTRA, the Alberta Oil Sands Technology Research Association, was an amazing expenditure of government resources where we built something with a resource that didn't make sense before we actually applied some science to it and actually some money from the taxpayers of Alberta. And now we've got the envy of the world again from a resource perspective. We don't have to drill for this resource. It's available. It gets better and more efficient every year. And the carbon footprint on it and its production gets better every year as well. So it sure beats looking for oil offshore like the big majors are doing right now, and other countries as well, including Norway, by the way. We are actually the envy of the world for that resource, and we need to make sure that we continue to get value for it and we continue to make it better. Having that message known around the world as opposed to it being a dirty industry. It is not a dirty industry. It is cleaner by the day. And by the way, there's no extraction industry in the world that takes care of the environment and remediates as well as the oil sands industry does in Alberta. So having those facts known and making sure the true story is out there about how well we do is very important. So conferences are great, but you need hearts and minds, and the more people we have out there and the more delivery mechanisms we have, I think will add value to our message going forward. And I'm going to go to one here from Diane. Diane asks, each year we lose a little bit more of our natural environment to both human activities as well as the changing environment. It is vital that we make every effort to ensure that we try to safeguard some of the last natural areas and the species within to ensure their longevity. What will you do to ensure that nature is protected? I think we've got a great natural environment in Canada, and we do need to protect it. We do need to make sure it's there for not just our generation, but generations to come. And you think about all the species we have in Canada. We've got some great protected areas. We've got goals to make sure we ensure that more of those areas are protected, those environmentally sensitive areas. But that'll come when we're in government, and I want to make sure that we recognize how important the environment is. My focus right now, Diane, is to ensure that people understand how important and how well we're doing on the environmental effects of our resource extraction, particularly compared to the rest of the world. So understanding how well those technologies come along and how well we do is part of the equation. People talk about the whole CO2, but CO2 is one of the issues we need to make sure we address. The other greenhouse gases are also in the equation, and we've made great strides with methane reduction as opposed to the rest of the world. We also need to make sure that we reduce the plastic pollution that we export around the world right now. These are all issues that face the world, face us as Canadians, and I think we need to start taking credit for the things we're doing well, and we need to keep getting better at those as well, because that's part of our advantage. Thank you. Got some more questions. I can't read the one here, so I'll just go to one that I had pre-submitted here. Or actually, there she is. Patty asked me, if we expand the natural gas industry in Alberta, we will create more jobs in the oil sands sector. How can we get more notice of this? For every one oil sands worker, there are 8 to 9 in the natural gas industry. Well, that's interesting, Patty. I actually didn't know that last stat, that there's 8 to 9 in the natural gas industry. I know the service economy, the oil and gas service sector, has more employment than the actual production sector, but I didn't know that natural gas was more of an economic and job driver than the actual oil sands industry. There's a lot of oil sands, as you know, there's the surface mines, but there's also the in situ. So I'll take a look at that stat you gave me. The number one thing we need for all our resources is market access. So getting egress to the markets is fundamentally important, whether it's oil or natural gas. And I know Anna asked me earlier about getting our natural gas to the coast because we're bound to one buyer at this point in time, so we're a price taker. And that buyer has had a surplus of natural gas for the last few years, and our production has actually gone down. And we need to make sure that we actually get that resource that is so valuable in the world from an environmental perspective, but also from an energy perspective. We need to find other markets and make sure we have that access to markets. So that is the Canadian government's responsibility in making sure that provinces access tidewater. And if the government changes here, and we hope it does sooner rather than later, then one of our agenda items is very clearly to get those resources to market. You recall as well that this government was the one that reversed the National Energy Board at that point in time, their decision on the Northwest Gateway pipeline, and they didn't really change the pipeline. They just suddenly said that, okay, it's illegal now with a new bill to ship oil offshore Prince Rupert in an area where American tankers are traversing the waters on almost a daily basis. So it's incredibly hypocritical. It's shutting down our industry versus industries around the world. And so to get back to the answer to your question, all of our resources need access to markets, and that access will happen via pipelines for our hydrocarbons. Thank you. I'm going to ask a question here from Robert. Robert says, I note the imminent sale of TMAC Resources to a company controlled by the People's Republic of China. TMAC owns a large chunk of Canada's north, bordering on the Northwest Passage. It measures 20 by 80 kilometers. If this deal goes through, a valuable Canadian company and the resources it controls will be in the hands of a foreign, often hostile power. This should raise concerns about Canada's defense, as well as showing China that we are unwilling to stand up to their bullying of Canada and Canadians. Can you reassure me the Government of Canada will not allow this sale to proceed? Well, I can't assure you that right now at all, Robert. I apologize. There are some very serious issues at stake here, and it's one we have to be very careful about. Number one of which is, of course, our Canadian resource development. The thing about TMAC Resources is that and from a fund manager and resources in the past, Canada is a net importer of capital for its resource development always. We never completely fund our own resource development. We need people, countries, investors from around the world to come in and help us finance what we develop. If we don't develop those resources, we don't earn the economic benefit from those resources. So that includes TMAC. I mean, TMAC was a mine being developed, but now there's about a $500 million facility that needs to be built, including the involvement of the Inuvialuit up in the area that would be intricately involved. So there's a few factors here at play, including involvement, including indigenous prosperity, including actual resource extraction that won't happen without somebody developing that site. Whether that should happen with a hostile foreign actor, and right now I say hostile because they have 2 Canadians that are being held hostage at this point in time in jail in inhospitable circumstances, and for the reason that they're trying to influence us on some other issues we have with them, which include the trial or the pending extradition of a Huawei executive in Vancouver, Meng Wanzhou. So the issue is, of course, the Northwest Passage and China's access to the Northwest Passage. We recognize the Northwest Passage as Canadia's jurisdiction. No other country in the world does. So if we're going to recognize that, we have to make sure we get up there and make sure that we're there all the time. That's part of our Northern Development Strategy, and as you'll probably know, one of my responsibilities now is Canadian Northern Economic Development. So that's something that I need to take a good look at. And these things, obviously there's a national security concern about a foreign actor being in that area. And there's also that balance that, the development of the resource itself, where we will financially benefit, and the native population will also financially benefit in the equation. What I want to make sure that people know is that when there's resources in Canada, those resources are owned by the people of Canada. The Northwest Territories, it's the people of Canada. If you look at Alberta or any other province, it's the people of the province that own that resource. When somebody comes in and buys the ability to exploit that resource, that's what it is. And if we determine that they're a hostile foreign actor, then removing them from that site is part of national security. So we do not have, it's not as if we don't have any recourse at some point in time. And that's the balance we have to have here. So all those things need to be taken into consideration in the TMAC decision. I'm anxious to see where the government goes on that. Obviously, we'll have our position on that at that point in time as well, Robert. But happy to discuss that further with you, because it obviously is a complex file about what we need to accomplish, both domestically and in a world sense. Thank you. I've got another question here from Michael. Michael asked me, I've got concerns with the revised federal wage subsidy. I run a small business and my issue is with the sliding scale for the revised subsidy. I can see how it might work for businesses that are able to restart, but the sliding scale for a business like mine that likely won't be able to run until the vaccine is developed isn't helpful. We have less and less money each month as we try to keep up with rent and the basics, yet the government support is going to decline. It doesn't make sense for businesses that cannot run due to the pandemic. How does a business with no revenue manage to keep employees under this plan? Well, Michael, I'm particularly concerned about people making sure they get to pay their bills, because making sure that people come through this pandemic is the number one thing we need to do. Make sure you're safe, make sure that you're taken care of and your family is taken care of, both from a health perspective and an economic perspective. I've had many discussions with businesses around Calgary, and one of the things we've actually talked about is how do you remove the actual fixed expenses from businesses that can't operate or can only operate at a minimum level during this pandemic. And you think about what those fixed expenses are. If the government's covering through the emergency wage subsidy, the bulk of some subsistence, if you don't mind me putting it that way, for your employees, the other parts of your business are going to have to make sure that they forestall any collections as well. That includes rent, that includes municipal taxes, and of course there'll be a cost to the city to that if they're no longer able to collect municipal taxes from the businesses that own property around town. So there's a bunch of issues like that we have to look at, but making sure that those fixed costs come out of the equation are important. I need the businesses that are there now to make sure that they're there when we come out of this pandemic. Because the only thing that happens at the end of the day, I revert to the fact that entrepreneurs are entrepreneurs. If you're a person that runs a Greek restaurant now, chances are when the market accepts it again and people can start getting out again, you're going to own a Greek restaurant again. So the issue about what we have to do to make sure we don't go through what we call losing the crumbs in the process, that is paying lawyers and accountants and the government for the insolvency costs and then the restart costs that are associated with that, I think is beneficial for society throughout the equation. So make sure that you survive in the meantime and make sure those fixed costs are not thrust upon your shoulders while you're making no revenue, I think is the best approach going forward. We'll see if we can actually get that on the table about how we do that. I think that's it as far as the questions I've had go. I haven't seen any more come in. So I'd like to get to the quick wrap up here, and I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. And it's been great talking to you. You probably heard more from my voice than you've heard for a long time. And I'm sorry I haven't been out and about in Calgary, but there's not been too many events to get out and about at. So most of my events are like this. They're on Zoom or Google Chats or WeChat or those sorts of things. But it's been great hearing and answering your questions as well. So I appreciate those that pre-submitted, and I hope I was able to give you some thorough answers. And if I didn't answer them thoroughly, please reach back to my office and say, look, I need some further detail on what you talked about, whether it's TMAC resources, which is complex, or whether it's our green strategy, or whether it's the Paris Accord. I'm happy to go into that further. But there's a lot of issues that in this speech from the throne that I think we need to be concerned with as Calgarians, as Albertans, as people that support the energy industry and recognize how important that industry is to our environmental and economic future going forward. We've got a lot of work ahead. We're going to hold this government to account. I'm excited for the challenge. I'm happy with my new role, and it's been drinking from a fire hose in many respects as far as all that I've got to get caught up on here. But it is what I came here for, and I hope I meet all your expectations. If you ever have any questions on what I'm doing, make sure you reach out, because being responsive to you is my number one priority here. Thank you, everybody. Make sure you have a good night. You can get a hold of me anytime at Greg, greg.mclean, MCLEAN, at parl, PARL.gc.ca. And my office number in Calgary is 403-244-1880. Thank you again. It's been a great evening, and I look forward to doing more of these.